Hello and welcome, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend this learning session hosted by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Action Team that's focused on creating opportunities for us to learn and grow together. My name is Andrea Hewitt. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the CSR and Engagement Advisor at McInnes Cooper. I'm also a member of our DEI Educate Action Team, and I have the privilege of welcoming you to this discussion today. We have with us an exceptional guest speaker. Amber Chisholm is a lawyer, a co-founder of Imprint Youth Association, and an advocate for the 2SLGBTQIA+ community. Many of you will recall that Amber joined us for a Pride panel discussion back in 2021, providing an important perspective on the law and its impact on members of the community. With input from our own Pride at MC group, we acknowledged the importance of facilitating a discussion about the rise of anti-2SLGBTQIA+ rhetoric, and Amber was an obvious choice to help us learn and act in solidarity with the community. Before we dive in, I'll ask you if you could respectfully stay on mute with your camera turned off until we open the floor for discussion. In the meantime, please feel encouraged to share thoughts or ask questions in the chat. Nicolette Bellevaux will lead a Q&A at the end, and she will share any questions that are entered there. First, we'll take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands across Turtle Island. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I invite us all to acknowledge the importance of the lands on which we live and work and from which we have benefited. I am located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I encourage you all to share and acknowledge in the chat the lands that you call home. We do this to affirm and commit and reaffirm and commitment, we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures, including those who identify as Two-Spirit. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. Before we begin our discussion with Amber, we thought it would be helpful to do a quick review of some key terms, being respectful of all gender identities and sexual orientations. Is essential to create self and inclusive space. So understanding the spectrum that is an important step on the path to allyship. Let's start with the acronym that we typically use in our communications, which is 2SLGBTQIA+. Note that the definitions we're using come from the glossary of terms published by the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. There are many terms in the document to which I'll add a link in the chat bar. So these are just some, and it includes various different communities. You can refer to the chat going forward if you wish to refer to the document. So we'll start with 2S. So 2S means Two-Spirit, and it's an English umbrella term to reflect and restore Indigenous traditions that honor the fluid and diverse nature of gender and attraction and its connection to community and spirituality. We place 2S at the beginning of the acronym to acknowledge them as First Peoples. Lesbian is a woman whose emotional, romantic, and/or physical attraction is to a woman. Gay is someone whose emotional, romantic, and/or physical attraction is to people of the same sex or gender. It's more commonly used to describe male attraction to other males, but men, women, and non-binary people may use this term. Bisexual is a term that's sometimes shortened to bi, that describes people who are emotionally, romantically, and are physically attracted to both men and women, or to more than one sex or gender. Trans is an umbrella term for people who do not identify with the gender binary. This includes non-binary, gender non-conforming, and transgender individuals. The asterisk is used when in written communication to indicate inclusivity. Non-binary is a way of identifying and or expressing oneself outside the binary gender categories of male or masculine and female feminine. Queer is an umbrella term used by some who identify as neither heterosexual nor cisgender. It is becoming more widely used within the community because of its inclusiveness and is sometimes used for convenience in place of acronyms, but should not entirely replace the acronyms. Historically, the term was used offensively as a slur and has been reclaimed for use within the community. Transgender people may or may not use the term queer as the communities have diverse histories. Cisgender, and I actually didn't even realize that there was a flag for cisgender, but there is. So cisgender is anybody who identifies with the same gender assigned to them at birth. The term is often shortened to cis or gender normative. And then QT BIPOC stands for Queer, Trans, Black, Indigenous People of Color. QT BIPOC are acknowledged to encompass some of the most marginalized members of the 2SLGBTQIA+ community, existing at the intersection of racism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia. Accordingly, QT BIPOC individuals often face multiple forms of oppression. Okay, just some more. Intersex is someone who's born with anatomy, hormones, or genetic makeup that differs from the general medical definitions of male, female, and they're generally assigned a gender at birth by their doctors and family, but it is becoming an outdated approach. Asexual is someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction to others and has little to no interest in sexual activity or sexual relationships. Gender identity. Gender identity is how someone internally, mentally, or psychologically perceives their gender. Someone's gender identity can align with or differ from their gender they were assigned at birth. A person's gender identity can change over time as they learn about themselves and learn more terminology. Gender identity is distinct from biological sex. Misgendering is the act of referring to someone intentionally or not with a term that does not align with their gender identity. This includes using the wrong pronouns, using a trans person's dead name, or using a gendered term, sir, ma'am, husband, wife, etc., which is common in legal writing. And note that pronouns are not a preference, but they are a fact. So don't refer to people as their having preferred pronouns. They are their pronouns. Gender neutral language is using language that does not assume or assign a gender. So rather than saying guys, saying things like thanks friends, rather than saying husband or wife, you can say partner or spouse, and then gender neutral pronouns like they instead of he or she. Historically, the legal sector has been slow to adopt gender-inclusive language, let alone foster safe space for people who are not cisgender heterosexual. So we need to take big steps to do better, especially now at a time when we're seeing an alarming rise in anti-2SLGBTQIA+ behavior and even legislation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Josie to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Andrea. My name is Josie Hunt. My pronouns are she, her. I initiated our Pride at MC employee resource group last fall, and I'm also a member of our DEI Educate team. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. Amber Chisholm is a queer lawyer working in Fredericton, New Brunswick as the Associate Director of Public Legal Education and Information Service of New Brunswick, PSNB, a nonprofit organization that informs New Brunswickers about the law, their legal rights, and obligations. Amber is a founding board member of Imprint Youth Association for 2SLGBTQIA+ youth and young adults, which works to provide support resources and social activities for 2SLGBTQIA+ youth and young adults based in the Fredericton area. She has acted as an organization partner and supervisor for the Imprint Trans ID Clinic organized through the UNB chapter of One of Students Canada since its inception. While in law school, Amber engaged in scholarly legal research as well as community organizing around two convergent legal issues affecting the transgender community. the lack of explicit inclusion in New Brunswick's Human Rights Act, and onerous regulations limiting access to both medical and legal gender transition to people living in the province. In 2016, her paper, Gender Identity and Expression, Necessary Additions to the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, won the prize for Best Graduate-Level Essay by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Nova Scotia branch. Since graduating, Amber has continued to advocate for queer and transgender people within the province. Amber's hobbies include community musical theater, painting, and complaining about online discourse culture to her many pets. On behalf of everyone at McGinnis Cooper, I welcome and thank you for joining us today, Amber.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to Andrea and to Josie for that wonderful introduction. To Andrea for laying the groundwork and sharing some terms so that we can all work today from a shared understanding of what we're discussing. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from traditional Wolastoqey territory, and from my home, we have a beautiful view of the Wolastoqey River, which is covered by the 1725 Peace and Friendship Treaties. Before I get started, I actually do want to circle back to the definitions that Andrea so thoughtfully prepared and shared with us today. And it's just because whenever the subject of definitions come up, I really want to kind of shout to the rooftops to remind people that whenever we're talking about definitions within the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, these terms are inherently descriptive and not prescriptive. And what I mean by that is that they're terms that people use to find common ground to communicate something very internal, personal, and inherently amorphous to other people to kind of find that shared understanding. They're not terms that we use to put boxes around people and to tell them what they are or they are not. Which is why it's always inappropriate to tell people whether or not they actually are pansexual and not bisexual, or whether they might actually be transgender versus, gender diverse or a gender nonconformative cisgender person. So these terms can be very personal, and they can sometimes mean different things to different people because of their descriptive nature and the fact that they do tend to change over time. So to get started, thank you all so much for having me here and for engaging in this discussion. It's really heartening to see members of the legal community recognize the importance of this subject and engaging in dialogue about supporting this community that is absolutely subject to an ongoing moral panic playing out in the legal and political spheres. Today, I'd like to discuss these issues with you in two basic parts. So part one, about the first half of my talk today, is going to go over a brief history of queer and trans organizing in my home province of New Brunswick and discuss some of the major legal and political changes that have happened since the early 2000s. And then part two is going to be a discussion of the current political and legal climate as I see it. And I'll discuss some of the ways that pseudo-legal rhetoric and political organizing is being mobilized against the 2S LGBTQIS community. So for a as brief as I can get it, history. In the early 2000s, we did see a number of legal changes come in. We saw the Marriage Equality Act in 2005, which granted all couples the right to marry regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And obviously, that was a huge win on the national scale for equality rights. And just a year beforehand, in 2004, a New Brunswick human rights complaint actually went to the Labor Board. It was called AABB&CC versus New Brunswick. And that case involved a lesbian couple, one of whom had given birth to their child. And their plan had been for one of them to carry the pregnancy and then for the other to give their child the surname, her surname, on the birth registration. And when the day came, the non-gestational mother was denied the ability to register her name on the child's birth certificate at all, let alone to add her surname to as the child's surname. So at the time, our vital statistics framework did not, quote, permit the registration of a newborn of two parents of the same gender. So she then instead attempted to file papers with the court for an adoption order, allowing her to be placed on the birth record and to have the child assume her last name, but was likewise denied because at the time same-sex couples did not meet the definition of a spouse for the purpose of spousal adoption. So the case before the Labor Board, which had gone through the Human Rights Commission, was successful because the board agreed that submissions by the Human Rights Commission that the policy discriminated against couples where both parents were women in ways that didn't affect heterosexual couples. The justifications for the policy didn't really hold out in real world scenarios. So, for example, the Family Services Act, as it was at the time, allowed for certain presumptions of paternity. For example, if a man was married to the person giving birth or living with the person giving birth, there was a presumption that they were the biological father of that child without any need to actually prove a biological connection. So, requiring a woman who was in the same kind of partnership with the birth giving parent then was held to be de facto discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So, that was a huge win in terms of being same sex couples, specifically lesbian couples, being able to uh, parent their children from birth without necessarily needing to go through all of these administrative and legal hoops. But it's worth mentioning that gay cisgender men in New Brunswick still must always apply to adopt their own children, since they're never one of them is very rarely going to be the gestational parent, even where the surrogate has no genetic relation to the child and might actually biologically be one of their children. It's still required that they go through the formal adoption process, and we haven't really found a legal solution to those kinds of situations yet to make it a little easier. The momentum for transgender rights in New Brunswick didn't really gain mainstream attention until well into the 2010s, right around when I was in law school, actually. We were, in fact, the last province in Canada to amend our Human Rights Act to include the protected grounds of gender identity and gender expression. That happened in 2017. Previous to this, while the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission did consider transgender people to be protected from discrimination based on their status as transgender people, the lack of explicit inclusion in our human rights legislation presented some practical and philosophical problems. Primarily, the issue was that many transgender people just didn't believe that they were protected under our human rights legislation because the Act made no explicit mention of them, nor did any of the informational materials. So this led to instances where discrimination may have occurred, but someone was fired from a job or pushed out or evicted from their apartment because they were transgender, but they didn't believe they had any legal recourse, and even if they did know that the commission existed at all. It also presented an issue for those who did reach out to the Commission because, in order to fill out a valid complaint form, they had to identify the nature of the discrimination they experienced as being based on existing grounds, which usually ended up having to be based on either sex or disability. In the case of either of these, the analysis often led to invasive and unnecessary lines of questioning as part of the investigation process in establishing whether or not there was a valid claim. So, for example, in the case of filing based on sex, the analysis often took a very objectifying tone. A complainant had to discuss their sexual organs and root the basis of their complaint on a supposed incongruity of their body in order to advance a claim that what they had experienced was indeed discrimination on the basis of sex. In the case of filing based on disability, it required disclosure of the complainant's medical records, mental state, and mental health, just to argue, for example, that they had been evicted unfairly. And it also meant cooperating with the idea that there was something inherently wrong with or disabling about being transgender, usually through the lens of examining their gender dysphoria, or as it was called often at the time, gender identity disorder, which was a diagnosis imposed on transgender people up until it was removed from the fifth edition of the DSM in 2013. So this analysis was often inherently pathologizing, as it relied on the ideology that being trans in and of itself is a mental illness, similarly to how homosexuality, quote unquote, was treated up to, and to be honest, well after the DSM-2 was updated in 1973, removing previous entries that were called variously sexual orientation disorder or ego dystonic homosexuality. These two categories under the Human Rights Act were obviously inappropriate and insufficient means to conduct a thorough and authentic analysis of the experience of a transgender person experiencing discrimination at work, at school, in their housing situation. So in 2017, after a great deal of push from the community, the Human Rights Act was updated to include both gender identity and gender expression as grounds of discrimination. The two separate categories are both included because they are distinct concepts. So, as Andrea said, when we talk about gender identity, we do mean a person's inherent sense of who they are and what their gender is. So for me, that would be my own personal sense and understanding that I'm a woman. I go by she, her pronouns. I navigate through the world as a woman. I experience things that happen to me with the understanding that I'm a woman. When we discuss gender expression, that refers to a person's external presentation of themselves to the world, which is often informed by their understanding of their gender identity, but not necessarily prescriptively tied to it. So, for some people, that might mean shaving hair that grows on their body in certain places on their body only. It might mean, it might inform the cadence of their voice, the way they choose to express themselves in dress or in the ways they prefer to shop in a particular section of a store, so on and so forth. I'm using really general terms here because it's important to remember that the reason that this is a distinct term included in the legislation rather than gender identity being included all on its own is because expression of gender isn't linked to a specific gender. To put it another way, not all women dress the same or have an understanding of their womanhood in the exact same way. Two women might have very genuine understandings of their gender being a woman, but their gender expressions can be very different. So the inclusion of these two terms in the legislation aimed to capture both incidences where people were discriminated against based on their gender identity, the status of a transgender person, based on someone's refusal to treat them with dignity, acknowledging their gender, as well as instances based on their gender expression. So discrimination based on how they choose to dress or present themselves. We can see why, for example, in the workplace, these things might cover very different kinds of incidences and interactions. I'm going to add here too that it's important to remember that one ground for a human rights complaint is that isn't always discussed when we're talking about transgender people is sexual harassment. So someone might be experiencing discrimination at work based on their gender identity or expression, and the treatment they're experiencing might reflect that, but sometimes what they're experiencing is also sexual harassment. So, for example, being subjected to invasive and inappropriate repetitive questions or jokes about their body, about their sex life, about surgeries they may or not have had, about their choice of washroom, comments about their sexual organs, those really all do fall under the umbrella of sexual harassment as well. Lastly, I'm just going to give a quick talk about the legal framework for transition and how it's changed drastically over the past 5 to 8 years here in New Brunswick. Gender transition is a fairly wide reaching topic because it can involve a lot of different things. But from a legal point of view, we're talking about the process of updating one's gender identity, legal identity, sorry, to be in line with your lived gender identity. Uh, I'm going to talk in my capacity as a partner and supervisor with the UMB Pro Bono Students Imprint Trans ID Clinic, for which your firm is a very generous and supportive partner. And I'm going to cover how the process for legal and medical transition have changed in the very recent past, because they've changed actually quite dramatically in the past decade. We look at the transition process as having three overarching categories. So like I mentioned, legal transition involves those legal documents that reflect your identity, your ID, your passport, your birth certificate. Medical transition, which involves any medical procedures or prescriptions that a person may or may not access as part of their transition. And social transition, which is how somebody navigates the world socially, their name, their clothing, the way that they interact with other people. One individual person might be interested in all, some, or just parts of any of these categories as part of their own personal transition. Legal transition is the process I'll be focusing on today, but medical and social transition also play a role in how easily a person can actually access that legal transition, especially up until 2017 when we saw some changes to the legislation. We're looking at two main processes when we talk about legal transition. So there's changing one's legal name, which is often part of somebody's legal transition, and changing the marker that's labeled sex on your identity documents, primarily the birth certificate, from which flows the ability to then update other documents like your medical card, Medicare card, or your passport. The rules and the requirements are different for people under the age of 16 for either process, as this requires consent from both parents or alternatively, as far as I know, a court order dispensing with that consent. For the change of name, the process is fairly straightforward and hasn't actually changed much over time. It's the same process used by anybody who's changing their legal first and or last name. It's an application package sent through Vital Statistics with a fee. There's often a criminal record check involved. You need a sponsor, but it's fairly straightforward because many people navigate this process for many different kinds of reasons. There is something quite a bit different to be said about the history about the legal process to change one's sex designation. Prior to changes in our Vital Statistic Act in 2017, this process explicitly required that doctors and surgery be involved explicitly. So the application form required a declaration from a doctor that the person had had, quote, gender identity disorder and had undergone, quote, transsexual surgery to a degree that sufficiently changed their sex on examination by that doctor. It's important to note a few things about this particular requirement. So, first, transsexual surgery is not a defined term. It was not defined anywhere in the legislation itself, and it's not a valid medical term. There are a number of individual surgeries that a person might choose as an option as part of their transition, but none of them are standard for everyone or desired by everyone, and none of them are called transsexual surgery. That left the estimation of what counted as sufficient medical intervention to justify a gender marker change essentially up to the whims of individual healthcare providers who were filling out these forms, some of whom might have been willing to facilitate a transition with minimally invasive requirements, and others who might have required significantly more surgery up to and including sterilization. When the patient might not actually have desired that for themselves and their body, but it was presented as the only option to update their ID. Legal documents that reflect a person's gender identity can be important to have if someone doesn't want to be outed every time they need to use their ID. So, for example, your driver's license, buying alcohol, going to a bar, or going to the bank. It's not pure symbolism or ideology. Not having accurate identity documents is a matter of safety for many people. And we sometimes take for granted just how often we're required to show that ID. These surgeries were an explicit legislative requirement in order to access those legal documents. And the procedures were also, secondly, they were specifically exempt from our provincial Medicare coverage according to the Medical Services Payment Act under Regulation 8420 up until 2015. So they were listed in Schedule 2 as uninsured procedures under the blanket title, again, transsexual surgery. So this presented many issues as an undefined term that does not exist in the medical literature. And there were absolutely cases in New Brunswick where a transgender patient might have received refusals for care or medical bills for procedures like a hysterectomy that they may have otherwise needed medically, but were deemed administratively to be transsexual surgery and therefore uninsurable because they were transgender. So it's really nice to see that we've had some changes in recent years to remove some of these barriers. Both of those acts have been amended. The process no longer requires surgery of any kind nor a physical exam, simply a declaration by the applicant, a sponsor, and a written statement from a medical practitioner confirming the applicant's gender identity. Steps have also been taken to remove barriers. So, for example, if people are applying to change their sex designation, the fee for a new birth certificate is actually waived, including for applicants who apply. Oh, I'm sorry, just one second. I just wanted to mute that so it didn't continue to interrupt us. It wasn't urgent. Um, So the fee for a new birth certificate, sorry, was waived, including for applicants who applied to change their sex designation on their name and their name and their sex designation at the same time. I forwarded it. I hope that's the last interruption. I'm so sorry. So that's the end of my discussion about the history. We've seen some major changes. The Trans ID Clinic, which is a partnership with your firm, it has been wonderfully successful, and we've been able to help facilitate this process for many different people over the past couple of years. And it's really nice to see that we're seeing policy acknowledgement that that process was overly onerous and should be easier for people to navigate the world more safely and more authentically. So moving on to today's context, we are witnessing the rapid rise in mainstream hostility towards transgender people specifically. Trans people have always more or less been subject to suspicion by much of the general population and to hostility from plenty of people. But what we're seeing now, I think, is the rise in specific political and policy goals aimed to restrict transgender people from authentic participation in public life. The rhetoric openly includes calls to eliminate transgenderism and gender ideology from people who, in the same breath, also want to insist that that doesn't express an overtly genocidal intent. But to be absolutely clear, being trans is not a philosophy or an ideology. It's an immutable characteristic, and it's a liberty that we absolutely must not give leeway to those who wish to eradicate it, regardless of any fear mongering arguments that might be proliferating. I'm seeing two main moral panics at play now in the policy goals of anti trans movements. There's a strong movement of women who claim that transgender people, and most often specifically transgender women, pose a threat to cisgender women. This threat is said to exist in many arenas, in sports, in washrooms, change rooms, in rhetoric that supposedly erases women and motherhood. But in shorter terms, I would say that this moral panic amounts to we must protect women from transgender people. And the second moral panic that I'm seeing, and the one that I find genuinely a little bit more terrifying, is the rhetoric that 2S LGBTQIA plus people and trans people specifically are engaged in targeted and purposeful child grooming. We see this reflected in backlashes to drag story time. We see it in parents' rights movements aimed at banning 2S LGBTQIA plus content from public schools. And in shorter terms, I would say that this moral panic amounts to we must protect children from queer people. The ultimate goal of this movement widely is to ensure that trans people, and often specifically transgender women are the target, that they are denied access to all three major aspects of transition: the legal transition, medical transition, and social transition. And a major area of contention on the topic related to the first moral panic, protect women, is access to shared spaces that are often segregated by gender. So, washrooms, change rooms, for example. So called bathroom bills have proliferated in the United States, and access to gendered spaces is also a huge issue of contention in places like the UK right now. And we're hearing rhetoric rising again here in Canada, and it was absolutely top of the discourse back in 2015 as well during the debates around Bill C-16 to amend the Federal Human Rights Act. When it comes to movements calling for stricter legislated segregation in washrooms and changing rooms, I have really serious concerns about the application and enforcement of those rules. We've seen laws like this being passed in other jurisdictions, and it strikes me as a purely philosophical and wholly impractical use of legislative power. I generally don't believe that women can be said to have a constitutional right or a human right to single sex spaces. But if we did, then how exactly is that meant to work in practice? So enforcement in real time is difficult, if not impossible, to engage in, because we don't know, for example, who decides who doesn't meet the criteria to be in the bathroom. Is it based on appearance, so that we're essentially legitimizing harassment of people based on their adherence to gendered beauty standards and performance? Is it based on genitalia, so that we're normalizing the sexual harassment of anyone who doesn't look the way we think they should while they're in public, so then we therefore need to check? At what point, for example, does that conversation include an authentic discussion about privacy in segregated spaces? Um, when the argument claims that on the one hand, women deserve those segregated spaces, but on the other hand, that requires policing to the degree of sexual harassment based on nothing more than our assumptions about somebody's superficial appearance. Approaching or confronting someone in the washroom simply because they've been profiled as the kind of person who looks like they shouldn't be there seems to me to be an obvious infringement on their liberties. And I have a hard time taking seriously the argument that it's based on my right to a single sex space, to the extent that I can then weaponize my own sense of discomfort in order to engage in harassment and discrimination. Um, it's often chalked up to a sexually objectifying assumption about that person's sexual background and physical characteristics that, again, can't be proven without extremely invasive action. At that point, I genuinely believe that people are becoming the perverts they want to see in the world, where they're kind of engaging in this kind of harassment as a preemptive way of preventing harassment they think they might be subjected to. Someone's immutable nature, like their appearance and who they are, cannot by definition infringe on somebody's rights. And I think it's absurd to argue otherwise. somebody's behavior towards you can. So what instead we are seeing being advocated here here is a kind of gender profiling and an argument that we should, as a culture, agree that certain people who look a certain way or have certain sexual organs should by default be associated with sexual assault based on their appearance and not on their behavior. We've seen rhetoric regarding the second moral panic, protect the children, also influence our discussions around inclusion policies and access to healthcare. And in fact, we've seen healthcare bans proposed and adopted in other jurisdictions like some US states. Again, we've experienced here in New Brunswick firsthand the backlash to inclusion policies during the current controversy centered around New Brunswick Department of Education Policy 713. The proliferation of healthcare bans for transgender people in the United States is very concerning. And even though it appears that courts may be halting or varying these bans, we all know that real harm can be caused by legislation in the meantime before courts get the chance to intervene. These bans are often pushed under the guise that these surgeries or medical treatment is overused and that they're being foisted on minors without reservation. Suggestions circulate widely that gender affirming healthcare is uniquely or particularly dangerous, but I'm not aware of any evidence that actually backs this up. Many medications and procedures that we would call gender affirming are procedures that everybody accesses, including cisgender people, from breast reduction or removal to labiaplasty to hormone treatment to hair removal. But they're only brought up in terms of danger and mutilation in the transgender context. So for these medical procedures that are more or less unique to trans folks, for those medical procedures that are more or less unique to trans folks, there's really no evidence that the recovery or satisfaction rate is disproportionate when compared to other medical procedures. Anytime the topic of transgender children comes up, we see kind of a lightning quick response from anti-trans folks who want to move the discussion from uncomplicated topics like privacy and respecting names and pronouns to instead discuss sensationalized ideas about surgery and mutilation performed on elementary school aged kids, which for the record, we all should know is not happening, except on children who receive care that aligns with current structural assumptions that babies and children must fit within the sex binary. So intersex children do have surgeries non-consensually performed on them. This one in particular, this whole bit of rhetoric around children has been at play around the current debate around Policy 713. And it's been troubling the way that the discussion has focused on transgender children. We saw here in New Brunswick allusions to medical care and hormones being used inappropriately in the sitting legislature. And this topic has actually nothing to do with a school inclusion policy. I feel that it was invoked to stoke fear and assumption about transgender people and their supposed influence on children and the ways that transition is supposedly being used inappropriately on people who are too young. It's an assumption that it's relying on the assumption that transition in the school contexts means medical transition, which it doesn't. It means social transition almost always. But we do hear people repeating this rhetoric uncritically. Most children simply can't access healthcare without their parents' explicit help. And regardless, trans children deserve equal access to medically approved and vetted healthcare as much as their cisgender peers, who are also accessing hormone blockers and hormone therapy when it's medically indicated. But nobody scaremongers about that in the legislature because those children are not part of a transgender outgroup subject to targeting right now. The idea is, I think, to invoke trans children and then to immediately discuss the experience of trans adults in the same breath to lead people to the assumption that transition is being applied in age inappropriate ways. This in particular with the rhetoric around grooming is the part that might scare me the most because it's false and disingenuous, but it's also genuinely dangerous. And it harkens back to the satanic panic and many other moral panics where violence against an outgroup was justified by a manufactured threat to women and children. I feel that this fear mongering is specific and it's targeted. The goal is to influence the sphere of law and policy. Anti-trans groups are advocating for legal bans and even punitive measures taken towards those who provide affirming care to transgender people. Sorry, I've got about 20 minutes left and I'm just taking a look at how much left I have to say. I do want to speak a little bit about the policy changes to do with permission as a prerequisite to respecting the name and pronouns of children in school under 16, which was a contentious issue under policy 713. We saw this come up as an issue being about supposedly parents' rights and protecting parents' rights. And we've seen rhetoric that suggests that the rights of queer and trans people and children are at odds with the rights of parents. And so we must be forced to make difficult but necessary decisions around how to prioritize this. My personal argument is that this dichotomy is a fallacy meant to appeal to general assumptions about the law that feel true but don't have an actual basis in law. So parents have rights in relation to the state, but they don't necessarily have rights in relation to their children. Children do not have legal obligations to their parents. It's the other way around. And so when it comes to the legal framework for the relationship between a parent and a child, children have rights and parents have responsibilities, including the responsibility to uphold and respect their children's rights. Most of the things that we would consider parents' rights, for example, engaging with medical professionals and giving permission for school registration, flow directly from those responsibilities they carry for that child, not as rights in and of themselves over that child. Children are people with rights and privacy and self-determination, and they're not property over which parents exercise unlimited authority. So why then are we seeing this rhetoric around parents' rights coming up so much when we're talking about queer people? Is it because the principle of state interference is believed to be implicated by schools' failure to proactively report home if a child has disclosed to their peers or to their teacher that they have a non-cis heteronormative identity? Do we then agree that parents have an established right to all information about a child that comes up at school, regardless of their express wishes to have that information kept private, regardless of the fact that disclosing that information might not implicate the child's safety at all? If that's the case, then should we not also agree that children don't have an expectation of confidentiality in other school settings with guidance counselors or with socialization with peers who might be from religious or cultural backgrounds that are at odds with their parents? I don't know where it ends here, and I don't know that it's a perfect analogy, but I do think that there's some serious questions we need to ask when we're talking about parents' rights to be proactively informed about a child's sexual orientation or gender identity simply because somebody at the school has become aware of it. I think an unspoken presumption here coming from legislators is that parents deserve to be informed about a gender identity in a framework akin to a reporting requirement against the express wishes of a child. If parents must be informed, regardless of what a child wants, then we have to assume that there is a reason why. I have a hard time understanding what that reason is unless we also assume that there's an assumption that parents have the right to intervene in that child's sexual orientation or gender identity. And I feel like that's a slippery slope. I think that there are a lot of questions to be had around this particular policy argument. The idea that coming out is a very personal thing for a lot of people. Some people come out in some contexts and never in others. Some people start having conversations in one place while they get ready to have safe conversations in others. And making the conversation simply about whether or not the child's home life is abusive, I think, is missing the point when we're talking about people's right to self-determination and to their protected immutable characteristics. That, I think, is all that I have prepared for today. I've kind of gone over some of my genuine concerns about the rhetoric that I'm seeing right now. And I've given you some context of some of the recent changes that we've seen legally and administratively. I'd love to know what kind of questions you folks might have for me, and what we might be able to discuss in the remaining 15 minutes or so.
Thanks so much, Amber. So as the slide says, if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll kind of just, I'll let you know when it's your time to speak, or if you just want to type it out, if that's easier, feel free to put it in the chat. So maybe while waiting, Amber, and thank you so much. That was really interesting. And as a fellow New Brunswicker, hearing your thoughts on kind of the current New Brunswick situation was really enlightening. It's definitely a story I've followed closely, but to have your input was really helpful in my own understanding. I have a few questions that we can start with, and then if we have some others, we can jump those in on. So
Sure.
we've talked a lot about the rhetoric and kind of a lot of the more so the negative rhetoric that we've been seeing from kind of across the border and internationally and kind of coming into our society now. And maybe we can take maybe a little more of a positive spin on it. So have you seen some responses to some of this negative rhetoric or these negative actions that give you hope in response to that more negative rhetoric?
I have. I think the negative rhetoric can be really scary. I mean, my partner is trans and non-binary, so it can be very easy to get caught up in this loop of kind of fear and a worry that this hate is going to spread, or that you don't know who's kind of hearing this and thinking, oh, actually, that does sound right. That does make me uncomfortable. But I think that by and large, what we're seeing often is that these movements are loud, but they're not as big as they think they are. So in the UK, for example, we do see some of this anti-trans rhetoric happening, but by and large, when they organize protests or demonstrations, the number of people who come out in support and solidarity for the queer community is often in much larger numbers. And we see people um, showing love and acceptance even in the face of that kind of backlash. One thing that I really like to see actually here in Moncton, New Brunswick, was there was a protest against the drag story time. And one of the drag kings that had been inside reading actually came outside afterwards and read a story about handling big feelings to the protesters. And I just thought that that was such like a wonderful kind of class act way of handling it. It kind of showed them like, I know you're having big feelings, but also like we're here and this is all I'm doing. Um, and I mean, a lot of this rhetoric is so easily debunkable. But the problem is that it appeals to things that feel true. And sometimes people's feeling about what's true is a lot more important than what, the facts or the law actually says. So having these kinds of conversations, I think, is really important so that we can remind people, a framework that we can look at this through is to remember that, for example, there's no written law that says that I have the right to a single sex space to the extent that I can kick somebody out.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, it's definitely. I remember that protest in Moncton and reading the news coverage afterwards and seeing it on Facebook, and I thought that was a really kind of like you said, on point way to do it in a respectful but in a kind of a pushback way. That was a really it was a good response. So speaking about responses, do you have any input about as what we can do as a firm to kind of be part of the response and help advocate for this and for the multiple communities?
Mhm. It's such a good question. I think like the legal community at large, I mean, you folks, to be completely honest, are doing more than most, in my opinion. You're supporting the Trans ID Clinic, which is direct praxis action to support people on the ground who need help. Like that is direct to the person, individual service that is, you can't put a price on that. Engaging in initiatives like this where you're entertaining ideas from different thinkers and from different people, so that you can help gain a framework and don't just listen to me, like listen to other people and what they're saying, even if they disagree with me. It's never a bad idea to get input from multiple people from the community on how you can be considering these issues and how you can be looking at it, because I really do think like as a firm, um, you do pro bono action and through like the PBSE program, and that's great. You can be explicitly supporting your queer and trans clients by proactively, asking about if somebody's going through a transition, helping to facilitate that on court documents. It's not a simple process to update somebody's name if they're halfway through a divorce and they've just come out as transgender. Having a lawyer who will go to bat for you and find that administrative framework to update that name, or to respect their name, even if it's not on their legal documents, goes a huge way. So I really do think that right now, um, being aware of things at the structural level is so important. And as lawyers, being aware of the ways that pseudo legal rhetoric is being weaponized in a way that it isn't meant to be used is really important. But even more important is your one on one interactions with your clients and with your community at large, and how respectful you are to people, and also how willing you are to kind of push back when you're in a situation where somebody is going a little off the rails against the community.
And what about maybe individually? So whether it be, us lawyers in our individual capacity when we're maybe, I mean, we always kind of wear our lawyer hats, but more or less so wearing our lawyer hats, and the rest of our staff and McGinnis Cooper community. What can we do to kind of be more active and intentional allies instead of maybe the more passive allies that I would argue I think a lot of people are?
Honestly, in my mind, like 70% of the work is showing up. If you know that there's some kind of gathering, rally, parade happening, like just consider going and being a body in the crowd. I think that like one of the things that these anti-trans and just like overarching reactionary movements that we're seeing rising right now, one of the things that they rely on is this idea that they're a silent majority. And they rely on a very savvy psychological understanding of the way that the human brain works, which is that if we believe that most people think something, we're more likely to believe that that thing is true. And so the number of bodies at a given rally can sometimes influence the people who see reporting on that rally or see, walk by, can influence them on thinking how legitimate it is. So, having more people show up in a rally to protect policy 713 than, the three people who showed up as a counter protest actually does mean something. Showing up and just asking whether you can help, if you know that your local community is holding a pride festival and just showing up and asking if you can help out, or what organizations on the ground need some support that you can give, whether it be helping with setup, helping with writing, helping, just be a volunteer. That is all invaluable.
Great. Those are some really awesome tips. And it's like you said, sometimes maybe we feel that, oh, we're just one person. But if every person who thought, oh, well, I'm just one person actually actively shows up, like you said, that's a whole lot of people. And there's strength in numbers, as the saying
hmm
goes. We talked a lot about youth and trans youth and just youth generally. So what advice would you give to parents, family members, close friends of youth who identify as either in any of the 2SLGBTQIA plus groups?
hmm Definitely find support. Find support for you specifically and not just for your child. There are groups in most major cities where they provide services to youth, but they also are a place where parents, when they're bringing their youth to that programming, they can meet and talk with each other. You can meet with the people running that programming. Some of them will even run parents groups to discuss ways to support their children or to work through any kind of feelings or thoughts that they might be having that they don't necessarily want to process with or in front of that child. It's normal to be confused and it's normal to have reservations about something that feels new to you. But being supportive and asking the questions is like the most important thing, and going to sources that are trustworthy and supportive for that information is really the most important thing. And there are absolutely groups out there like Imprint that can help find resources local to you. And there are places online that you can go for information about, ways to navigate this, and why it's important, for example, to use your child's name and pronouns, ways to practice even. Like it's really easy when you've known somebody their whole life under one name and pronoun, to forget or to just naturally fall into that old name and pronoun. But there are ways to practice. There are like exercises that you can download to work that through, and try to do that in your own time. Um, so yeah, just finding support for yourself and working through, what it is that you actually need so that you can be the best person that you can be for the child.
Great, thank you, Amber. And Jane she says it's more an observation than a question in the chat, but she says she is around trans youth a lot. In the last couple of years, the fear among them has grown, that they're truly afraid for their safety. And we need to show up by being loud and present in any rally or discussion so the minority of hate is silenced. So that really touches
Yeah.
on what exactly you've been saying this entire time, right?
It's so true, and I've been hearing it firsthand from a lot of youth as well. They're scared this summer. Like there are kids that don't know if the policy changes to 713 are going to remain in place or not, because we're still waiting on a report from our
Mhm.
child and youth advocate. And I was speaking to a child in grade 5 just the other day who said, like, I don't know what sports team I'll be allowed to play on. And they played soccer their whole life. It's scary, and we've noticed a distinct drop in attendance at our events since June, and I genuinely suspect it's because people are scared.
Absolutely. I don't see any other questions. So Amber, do you have any final thoughts that you wish to partake on the group before we finish up?
Yes, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for having me. Like, it was wonderful. I really appreciate that you as a firm are engaging in these discussions. It is invaluable just to be willing to listen, even if you don't agree. And if you do, great. And if you don't, ask more questions. Um, there are places to go to keep to speed on this. Stuff that's happening in the United States is scary. It's genuinely scary, and we have a different legal framework here in Canada that doesn't make it quite as easy for those swift policy changes to happen. But that doesn't mean that a legislator with strong intent and enough support couldn't do something that's not, technically legally allowed, that causes a lot of harm before the courts get their hands on it. So paying attention to what's happening now, because we know that as a country, what happens in the United States tends to follow as a trend here. Not to say that we're headed that way, but there absolutely will be people in the political sphere who are influenced by what's happening in the United States. Whether or not they're a majority is a separate question, but we've already seen the way that their rhetoric is affecting us. And places like Florida and Texas are not safe for transgender people and their families right now. In Texas, there's a law that is essentially taking children away from parents who affirm their gender identity as a child protection issue. And so people have fled the state. It's really frightening. And Erin Reed is a transgender activist who is doing a really good job on keeping track of this legislation. She has a heat map right now on her website on Substack showing where that legislation is changing and basically saying like a do not travel. This place is more or less safe. This place is iffy. So look into it and keep an eye on it because it's important to be aware of what might be down the pipeline among some circles.
Thanks so much, Amber. So that's all for us today. So I'll pass it back to Andrea just for the wrap up. But I personally want to say thank you, Amber. That was so informative. I learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicolette, and thank you, Amber, so much for your time and your wisdom and your knowledge. You've equipped us with a lot of information to go forward and be active allies. I hold questions about the moral panics that you talk about, and what's fueling that, because really there is no evidence that suggests that either of them are rooted in reality, and there's so many other examples, problematic examples of where cisgender heterosexual people have been a much greater threat for other women and youth. And so would you say it's just the fear of the other, like fear of the outgroup, or is it something that's kind of bleeding from other areas of the world?
I do think that it's a combination of both those two things you just mentioned. I think it's a fear of the outgroup, and I do think that the rhetoric from around the world is influencing where that outgroup exists for us in our social framework. I'm actually working right now on a piece that's going to be published in the NB Media Co-op not too long from now about the ties between trans exclusionary rhetoric among trans exclusionary feminists and the ways that it rhymes with a lot of Umberto Eco's factors on what influences a fascist movement, which inherently rises out of a sense of financial and economic insecurity, a need to blame hard times on an outgroup, and a really strong sense of immutable traditional identity. And like transgender people really threaten all of those things among some circles. So it's kind of a perfect target in today's climate.
Great, that's so helpful. Thank you. But my job was to thank you. So thank you. We have recorded the session for anybody who wants to watch again. I've just heard from one person who says that they want to watch again. So thank you for allowing us to do that, Amber. And we will be making a donation to the Youth Imprint Association to thank you for your time and your wisdom today. Thanks everybody
Thank you
for
so
joining.
much.